last teaching in the series on the Bible creation account, and in this last section we're having a look at the theory of evolution, and we're looking at certain scientific arguments that refute that particular theory. We looked in the previous teaching at two scientific arguments, the mathematical and statistical argument against that theory to disprove it, and then we also looked at the scientific argument about the lack of fossil record in the earth, which also disprove the theory of evolution or Darwinism. In today's teaching, we're going to look at the scientific argument that looks at the discovery of genetic code in DNA and how that discovery, which is relatively recent in the history of mankind, has been able to really refute the theory. Because don't forget, Darwinism and the theory of evolution is exactly that. It's a theory, it's not fact. It is a proposal that has been put forward by a natural man to try and explain the origin of life in the earth and how life has come about in the earth. And so we're looking at the three arguments. There's obviously a lot more than three. I've just highlighted three in this series. We're going to cite a fair amount of scientific quotations and from articles in today's teaching, because obviously we're looking at the scientific arguments that disprove the theory of evolution. And so with regards to this discovery of genetic code in DNA, it implies what scientists refer to as intelligent design. And so there is this argument that is out there that has been proposed roughly from about the 1970s onwards, this scientific argument that is put forward in the scientific community called intelligent design. Now there's a lot of throwback against that from the cardinal scientists, the scientists in the world. They try and discredit intelligent design as a way that Christians can bring God into the equation. And so they really do fight hard against this particular theory, but nevertheless there's a lot of sound scientific evidence for the proof of intelligent design. And in December 2004, a renowned British philosopher, a chap by the name of Anthony Flew, he made worldwide news when he repudiated a lifelong commitment to atheism. And what was his reason? He cited, among other factors, evidence of intelligent design in the DNA molecule. And so this particular evidence that has arisen in the earth has created quite a stir in the scientific community. And the modern theory of intelligent design was first formulated in the late 1970s and early 1980s by a group of scientists, Charles Thaxton, Walter Bradley, Roger Olson, and Dean Kenyon, who were trying to account for an enduring mystery of modern biology, i.e. the origin of the digital information encoded along the spine of the DNA molecule. In the book, A Mystery of Life's Origin, Thaxton and his colleagues first developed the idea that the information-bearing properties of DNA provided strong evidence of a prior but unspecified design in intelligence. And so what the scientists of intelligent design propagate is that they say, guys, the evidence is showing us that all of this information on DNA, encoded in the DNA, is evidence of intelligent design. So they don't say it's God who's done it. Obviously the implication is there, but they're just trying to bring across the logical concept of when you've got programming code, there has to be an intelligent designer behind the code that you're identifying. And so the scientists can identify the programming code in the DNA molecule, and so they're saying, well, someone had to put the code there and not random chance mutation. And natural scientists will say no, it was random chance mutation, and that's where the back and forth is taking place in the scientific realm as to where the code came from for the genetic code for the DNA molecules. You get the scientists that are saying it could have only been an intelligent entity that designed the code. The natural scientists are saying no, it was just random mutation selection. That's what produced the code. So carrying on with that particular scientific argument about intelligent design being responsible, over the last 25 years, scientists have discovered an exquisite world of nanotechnology within living cells. So as science has progressed, they've been able to look deeper and deeper into the living cells of living organisms, and they've been astounded as to what they've actually discovered. Say inside these tiny labyrinth enclosures, scientists have found functioning turbines, miniature pumps, sliding clamps, complex circuits, rotary engines, and machines for copying, reading, and editing digital information, which is hardly the simple globules of plasm envisaged by Darwin's contemporaries. Because Darwin's contemporaries, they view the origins of life as just one globule of plasm. And from there, all of the life that we see in the earth today has evolved. However, now that scientists can actually look inside the cells with the nanotechnology facilities that they have, they've been amazed to find all of these little functioning motors inside these cells. And so they go on to say, moreover, most of these circuits and machines depend on the coordinated function of many separate parts. For example, scientists have discovered that bacterial cells are propelled by miniature rotary engines called flagellar motors that rotate at speeds of up to 100,000 revolutions per minute. And they say these engines look for all the world as if they were designed by the Mazda Corporation, with many distinct mechanical parts made of proteins, including rotors, stators, O-rings, bushings, U-joints, and drive shafts. And so the comment is made, could natural selection have produced this appearance of a neo-Darwinism fashion of one tiny incremental mutation at a time? Because that's how random selection works, mutation works. It's one mutation is successful, builds onto the next mutation, which is successful, builds onto the next. And we dealt with that in the mathematical and statistical side, the impossibility of that actually happening. But there's a biochemist, Michael Behe. He argues that no. He points out that the flagellar motor depends on the coordinated function of 13 protein parts. And that's a very important point to understand. So we'll try and explain it a bit. Because what the theory of Darwinism states is that it's a random mutation of natural selection taking place. And so each part can be built on the next part based on the success of the part before. That's the logic. And you forget about the parts that don't work, that get discarded along the way. But in this particular motor, in fact, the scientists call it a flagellar motor in the bacterial cell, this motor requires, there are 13 protein parts that make up the motor. And let's just carry on with how they've described how it actually does work. He says, this is this Michael Behe chap. He points out that the flagellar motor depends on the coordinated function of 13 protein parts. All 13 have to work. He says, yet the absence of any one of these parts results in the complete loss of motor function. So in other words, it doesn't work. Sorry, let me carry on with what he says here. He says, remove one of the necessary proteins, as scientists can do experimentally, and the rotary motor simply doesn't work. The motor is, in Behe's terminology, irreducibly complex. So in other words, this is a very complex piece of machinery. This creates a problem for the Darwinian mechanism. Natural selection preserves or selects functional advantages. If a random mutation helps the organism survive, it can be preserved and passed on to the next generation. That's how Darwinism's theory works, is proposed, should we say. To the next generation. Yet the flagellar motor has no function until all of its 30 parts have been assembled. The 29 and 28 part versions of this motor do not work. Thus, natural selection can select or preserve the motor once it has arisen as a functioning whole, but it can do nothing to help build the motor in the first place, because adding one part to 2 parts to 3 parts to 4 parts, there's no functionality there. It needs all 30 parts to be built into it in order to start functioning. So natural random selection by mutation plays no role here. And so, it just doesn't, Darwinism doesn't work in this environment. It cannot work in this environment. And so based on uniform and repeated experience, mankind knows of only one type of cause that produces irreducibly complex systems. That is intelligence. And so whenever scientists discover irreducibly complex systems, such as an integrated circuit or the internal combustion engine, we know how they arose. They arose from a designing engineer that designed it in the first place. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. Or they weren't just randomly put together. Computer programs is a computer programmer who has designed the computer program. The internal combustion engine was designed by an engineer. Intelligence was at work behind the design of these organisms in the molecular world, and obviously in the functioning machines that mankind uses in the earth today. Always intelligence behind the design thereof. And that's what the scientists who are looking at molecular structures of cells today are saying, guys. These things are so complex and they have such a large amount of information stored in them as to how they are built up and thus then are able to function. There has to be intelligence behind the designing of these. And so no credible scientific argument has been able to refute Michael Behe's hypothesis that he's put forward. Not really a hypothesis, he's just basically stated things as they actually are. Another professor, a chap by the name of Stephen Meyer, makes a further argument for intelligent design in the following article. He says, but consider an even more fundamental argument for design. In 1953, when Watson and Crick elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule, they made a startling discovery. The structure of DNA allows it to store information in the form of a 4-character digital code. Strings of precisely sequenced chemicals called nucleotide bases store and transmit their assembly instructions, the information in other words, for building the crucial protein molecules and machines that cells need to survive. Francis Crick later developed this idea with his famous sequence hypothesis, according to which the chemicals constituents in the DNA function like letters in a written language or symbols in a computer code. And so just as English letters may convey a particular message depending on the arrangement, so do certain sequences of chemical bases along the spine of the DNA molecule convey precise instructions for building proteins. And the arrangement of the chemical characters determines the function of the sequence as a whole. Thus, the DNA molecules has the same property of sequence specificity that characterizes codes and languages. And even a chap by the name of Richard Dawkins, he's an outspoken atheist against obviously Christianity, scientist. He's acknowledged that the machine code of the gene is uncannily computer-like. And Bill Gates himself has also noted DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. And so very clearly there's the scientists have recognized that there's this programming in the DNA, and it is highly sophisticated, and therefore it has to come from an intelligent source. How did it get there? After the early 1960s, further discoveries were made that the digital information in DNA and RNA is only part of a complex information processing system in advanced form of nanotechnology that both mirrors and exceeds our own in its complexity, design logic, and information storage density. Where did the digital information in the cell come from? And how did the cell's complex information processing system arise? Today, all these questions lie at the heart of the origins of life research. And so there's no natural scientists who propose Darwinism, and also those who just talk about chemical evolution. They can't explain where all this information came from. There's nothing that they can come up with that is able to explain, all right, please explain, where did these sequences of DNA written code, these 4 letters that they've discovered, in certain sequences produces certain different cells, and those cells produce different other molecules or proteins, and they're used to build these different functioning parts within the cell, building up to the organisms that we see in the earth today. And so there's no, to be able to, because the way that random mutation works, it says that if you try and imagine it, intelligent design says an intelligent designer put the letters in sequence so that they can be read, so that they can be followed. The instructions can be followed because they can be understood and thus followed, and thus the machinery can be built. And that's the proteins. They read the code and they say, okay, well now this must go, this part must be added to this part must be added to this part, and then the machine is built. I'm just kind of simplifying it as much as I can. The natural scientists say, no, there wasn't any kind of design on the code, because they see the code's there, they acknowledge it's there. They say the way that the code arrived is that ink was splashed onto the paper and it just randomly produced this code. And now the proteins can follow that code. Obviously, it's as far-fetched as you can possibly imagine to try and explain how all of this code in fact did come into being in the first place. Clearly something else is at work with regards to how the code was put in sequence so that these various machineries in the cells could be built. And so scientists who argue for intelligent design, they don't look at, they not try to discount natural process, chance, laws, or combination of fail to explain. They're just saying that, guys, we know from just our normal observation of things in the earth today, we know that when we look at a machine that is built, we know that by examining the machine, we know that somebody, an intelligent person, designed that machine, because it didn't just appear out of nowhere. When we look at a computer program, we know that an intelligent person designed that computer program. It didn't just appear randomly out of nowhere. And so that is their argument about intelligent design. Now, obviously, as believers, as Christians, we understand the intelligence is in fact God. God is the one who placed that genetic code into the DNA of the molecule so that the proteins in those molecules could then follow that instruction and build the various motor parts that are required in order for the organism to be built up and thus function. And so, very clearly, with regards to the discovery of DNA molecules and scientists being able to look at this genetic code that is on the DNA, it is just further very, very strong evidence that refutes the argument of Darwinism and natural random selection by chance mutation taking place, which is what evolution really is all about. Just everything just happens by accident, and that's not the case at all. God is the one who has created all things. And so it's by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. And then that brings me to the last point that I want to make on this point of evolution, which is something that's crept into the church relatively recently, and that is called theistic evolution. Now, theistic evolution is, as I say, it's a relatively new theory. It's made its way into the church. It's embraced by certain religious organizations, namely the Roman Catholic Church and similar mainline Protestant denominations. They've started to embrace this theory called theistic evolution. So what is it? Well, theistic evolution, these religious organizations have recognized that biblical doctrine as it was taught in the past, 6,000 years ago, the earth was created, 6 days of creation, it just falls short when compared with scientific evidence. So now, because they are not able to rightly divide the word of truth, what they do is they say, okay, we can't keep preaching this anymore because this is obviously erroneous compared to all the scientific evidence out there. So what they do is they try and then embrace evolution and bring it into the Bible by trying to marry the two. And so they've come up with their term called theistic evolution. In other words, their viewpoint is that, okay, evolution is right. It's because they can't argue about, well, they erroneously can't argue about the theory of evolution, but we've obviously shown it to be completely false. But because of their lack of understanding on these issues, they said, okay, evolution must be right because the whole world believes it. So let's try and get God involved in the process. And so they add the theistic part to evolution. So what do they mean by doing that? Well, evolution says that everything takes place by an unguided process. In other words, all random chance mutations by natural selection. This is how evolution works from one step to the next. But it's all pretty by chance, by accident. It's unguided. There's no divine intervention. Okay, there's no intelligent design. Nothing like that. Everything's just random chance selection, mutation. It's by chance. So what the church, well, not the church, but these guys in the church try to do is they say, what we're saying is God got involved with the unguided chance mutations. So in other words, they're saying that the unguided chance mutations are in fact guided by God. God is the one who says, okay, now we'll move to the next step and the next step and the next step. Well, the world, the scientists in the world laugh at this because they recognize that what the church is trying to do is they're trying to sneak God in through the back door on the evolutionary process, and they just mock it for what it is. These particular religious organizations are also unable to explain how is it possible that an unguided process can be guided at the same time. You can't reconcile the two. You cannot have a guided, unguided process. And so it's a religious way of trying to combine the Bible with evolution. And the two don't marry because evolution is completely false. And these people who try to marry the two through this theory of theistic evolution, they are obviously people who do not rightly divide the word of truth in the first place anyway. So they're just trying to make their religions able to fit in with the world today, because they recognize their religions are starting to become archaic in the eyes of the world, and so they're trying to marry the two, which you can't do anyway. And so the proponents of theistic evolution, as we said, the proponents of young earth creation theory, most of them are evangelicals and they're born again believers, and their doctrine on salvation is correct. Their doctrine on the origin of the life on the earth, etc., is incorrect because they do not rightly divide the word of truth. However, their doctrine of salvation is correct. But those who propose theistic evolution, not only is their doctrine of theistic evolution completely false, because you cannot have a guided, unguided process, these are also people who are not born again. They're not Christians because they don't recognize the fact that evolution is completely atheistic and false, and you can't marry the two, trying to bring God and atheism into the same boat. It just doesn't work. And so this particular theory is not put together by born-again believers. This particular theory is put together by religious people, really. And based on that point, I'm going to close off today's teaching, and that also brings us to the close of the series of the Bible